Hello, brother. In a world where empires rose on the backs of countless men, there came a moment when only 300 stood against the tide of 100,000. No walls to protect them, no hope of victory, only a narrow pass, a king who would not kneel, and warriors who had already chosen death over dishonor. This is not the story of how they survived, but how they became immortal. Don't forget to support my channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Chapter 1: The Shadow of War. A scorching wind swept through the narrow pass of Thermopylae, carrying with it the scent of dust, iron, and something far more ominous, the promise of blood. King Leonidas stood unmoving at the mouth of the pass, his crimson cloak snapping sharply behind him like a banner of defiance against the rising storm. Before him stretched a sight that would have broken lesser men, an ocean of soldiers, their armor glinting beneath the relentless sun, their ranks so vast they blurred into the horizon. The Persian army had come in numbers no one could truly count, 100,000, perhaps more, and with them came the weight of an empire determined to crush anything that stood in its path. Yet Leonidas did not waver. His gaze was steady, his breath measured, his presence alone enough to anchor the 300 warriors who stood behind him. They were silent, but not from fear. Each Spartan knew why he was here. Each had embraced the unspoken truth that this ground would likely become his grave. The earth beneath their sandaled feet felt alive, trembling faintly as the enemy advanced, a distant thunder growing louder with every passing moment. Still, there was no panic among them, only discipline, honed from years of relentless training, and a shared understanding that their duty outweighed their lives. Leonidas slowly raised his spear, not as a signal of attack, but as a quiet declaration. This was where they would stand, and this was where they would hold. The narrow pass behind him, carved by nature itself, was their only advantage, a thin line between survival and annihilation. Here, numbers meant little. Here, courage would be tested beyond all limits. The wind howled once more, as if the land itself bore witness to what was about to unfold. Somewhere in the distance, a war horn echoed across the valley, low and foreboding, followed by the synchronized march of thousands. The battle had not yet begun, but its shadow had already fallen. And in that moment, as the world seemed to hold its breath, Leonidas allowed himself a single thought, not of victory nor of glory, but of legacy. For even if they were to fall, the story of this stand would outlive them all. Chapter 2: The Spartan Oath. The morning sun rose slowly over Thermopylae, casting long shadows across the rocky ground as the 300 Spartans prepared themselves in silence. There was no chaos, no shouted orders, no visible anxiety, only ritual, discipline, and purpose. Each man moved with deliberate precision, fastening bronze armor that had been polished to a dull gleam, tightening leather straps worn from years of training, and lifting shields that were not merely tools of war, but symbols of identity. These shields bore the weight of their city, their families, and the unbreakable code they had lived by since childhood. To a Spartan, retreat was not an option, and survival was never the highest honor. Duty was. Leonidas walked among them, his presence calm yet commanding, saying little, for words were unnecessary. He did not need to remind them of their oath. It lived within them. They had all spoken it before leaving Sparta, standing before their kin, their voices unwavering, to return with their shield or upon it. It was not a threat, but a truth they had accepted long ago. Around them, the air was thick with anticipation, broken only by the faint clink of metal and the distant murmur of the approaching army. One young soldier, no older than 20, paused for a brief moment, his grip tightening on his spear. His thoughts flickered to home, to the warmth of the sun over Spartan fields, to the faces he might never see again, but the hesitation passed as quickly as it came. He straightened, drawing strength from the men beside him, from the unyielding line they formed together. Brotherhood, forged through hardship and blood, bound them tighter than any chain. Leonidas finally stopped at the front, turning to face his warriors. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, everything was understood. No speech was needed, no grand declaration required. They were ready. As the first distant horns of the Persian army echoed through the pass, the Spartans lifted their shields in unison, the sound a deep, resonant thunder that rolled across the valley. It was not merely preparation, it was a promise that they would stand, that they would fight, and that no matter the odds, Sparta would not yield. Chapter 3. A Sea of Men. By midday, the full magnitude of the enemy revealed itself. What had once been a distant shimmer on the horizon had become an overwhelming reality, a vast shifting mass of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. The Persian army moved like a living tide, its ranks layered deep and wide, banners snapping in the hot wind, drums beating in a steady, ominous rhythm that seemed to echo from the very earth itself. Lines of archers, infantry, and cavalry filled the valley beyond Thermopylae, their armor flashing beneath the sun in waves of bronze and gold. To any ordinary force, the sight would have been enough to shatter resolve, but the Spartans did not flinch. From their position within the narrow pass, the 300 watched in silence as the sea of men advanced. The ground trembled more noticeably now, each synchronized step sending a pulse through the stone beneath their feet. Dust rose in thick clouds, partially veiling the enormity of the host, yet doing nothing to lessen its presence. It was said that the Persian king commanded nations, not merely soldiers, and here, at this very moment, that claim seemed undeniable. Languages, armor styles, and battle standards varied across the ranks, yet they all moved with a singular purpose: to break through. Leonidas stood at the forefront, his expression unchanged, as if the impossible odds before him were of no consequence. He studied the terrain once more, the narrow corridor hemmed in by steep rock walls and the sea beyond. This was their advantage, their chosen ground. Here, the enemy's numbers would be forced into a choke point, reduced from an ocean into a stream. It would not make the battle easy, but it would make it possible. Behind him, a murmur passed quietly among the Spartans, not of fear, but of recognition. They understood what they faced. This was no ordinary battle. This was a stand against overwhelming force, a moment that would define not only their lives, but their legacy. One warrior adjusted his grip on his shield, another rolled his shoulders beneath the weight of his armor, and another allowed himself a brief, grim smile. They were ready. As the Persian front lines began to slow, reorganizing just beyond the mouth of the pass, a heavy silence fell between the two forces. It was the calm before the storm, the final breath before impact. Then, from across the field, a commanding voice rang out, followed by the blare of horns that split the air like thunder. The sea had reached the shore, and now it would crash.
Chapter 4. The Gate of Death. Thermopylae was never meant to be a place of glory. It was a scar carved into the land, a narrow passage pressed between jagged cliffs and the restless sea, where the world seemed to constrict into a single unforgiving line. To the untrained eye, it appeared insignificant, almost forgettable, but to Leonidas, it was everything. This was where empires would be tested, not by their size, but by their resolve. He stepped forward, boots scraping against the stone, and let his gaze travel along the length of the pass. The cliffs rose steeply on one side, rough and unyielding, while the waters of the gulf shimmered on the other, leaving only a thin corridor where men could march. There would be no flanking here, no grand maneuvers, no sweeping cavalry charges. The battlefield would reduce itself to something raw and intimate, shield against shield, breath against breath, life against death. Behind him, the Spartans tightened their formation, instinctively drawing closer together as if responding to the land itself. Their shields overlapped, bronze edges locking into a unified wall, their spears angled forward like the quills of some great beast preparing to strike. This was the phalanx, the heart of Spartan warfare, perfected through years of discipline and sacrifice. Here, no man fought alone. Each warrior was a link in an unbreakable chain, and if one faltered, all would suffer. But if they held, nothing could break them. Leonidas turned slightly, addressing them not with a speech, but with a simple command carried by calm certainty. "Hold this ground." The words were few, but they carried the weight of destiny. The men responded not with cheers, but with action, feet planting firmly, shields lifting higher, grips tightening around worn spear shafts. They understood what was required. Across the pass, the Persian forces began to shift, their massive numbers compressing as they prepared to enter the narrow corridor. What had once been an advantage now became a burden, their endless ranks forced into a confined space where only a fraction could fight at once. The roar of their army dimmed slightly, replaced by the sound of movement constrained and redirected. A tense stillness fell once more, heavier than before. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if unwilling to disturb the moment. Then, with a sudden surge, the first wave of Persian soldiers advanced into the pass, their footsteps echoing sharply against the stone walls. Leonidas raised his spear. "Spartans," he said quietly. The line braced. "Forward." And with that single word, the gate of death came alive. Chapter 5. The First Day. The first day of battle began not with a charge, but with a shadow. It crept across the pass as thousands of Persian archers raised their bows in unison, their movements fluid and practiced, their presence stretching across the horizon like a dark pied. For a brief, suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the sky disappeared. Arrows surged upward in a single sweeping motion, blotting out the sun as they reached their peak before descending in a deadly storm. The air screamed as iron-tipped shafts tore through it, falling toward the Spartans with relentless force. "Shields!" came the command, sharp and immediate. In perfect synchronization, the Spartan line moved as one. Bronze shields lifted and locked together, forming a solid barrier that gleamed beneath the fading light. The impact was thunderous. Arrows struck with violent force, clattering and splintering against the wall of shields, some embedding deep into the wood beneath the bronze, others snapping and falling uselessly to the ground. The sound was deafening, a storm of metal against metal, but the line held. Not a single man broke formation. When the final arrows fell, a tense silence lingered, broken only by the soft thud of the last shafts hitting the ground. Then, as if the attack had only been a prelude, the Persian infantry advanced. They surged forward into the narrow pass, their numbers pressing from behind, forcing the front lines into the Spartan wall. The confined space stripped away their advantage, turning their overwhelming force into a bottleneck of bodies and steel. Leonidas did not shout. He did not need to. "Now," he said. The Spartan phalanx moved. Spears thrust forward in unison, a deadly forest of points striking with precision and discipline. The first ranks of Persian soldiers fell almost instantly, their momentum broken as they collided with an unyielding wall. Those behind them pushed forward, unaware or unable to stop, only to meet the same fate. The Spartans advanced one step, then another, their movements measured, controlled, relentless. The clash became brutal and immediate. Shields slammed against shields, bodies pressed together, and the narrow pass echoed with the sounds of struggle, grunts, cries, and the harsh ring of metal striking metal. The Spartans fought not with wild fury, but with calculated efficiency. Each strike had purpose, each movement was deliberate. Hours passed, though it felt like moments. The sun climbed high, bearing witness to the unbroken Spartan line and the mounting losses before them. The Persians withdrew at last, not in victory, but in exhaustion and shock. And as the dust settled over Thermopylae, the message was clear. The first day belonged to Sparta. Chapter 6: The Bronze Wall. By the second surge of battle, the Spartans had become something more than men. They were a force of nature, unyielding and precise, their formation holding like a wall forged from bronze and willpower. The narrow pass amplified their strength, turning every inch of ground into contested space where discipline outweighed numbers. The Persians returned with renewed aggression, their commanders driving them forward with urgency, determined to break the line that had humiliated them on the first day. But what awaited them was not fatigue, nor hesitation. It was perfection. The Spartan phalanx stood firm, shields interlocked so tightly that not even a blade could slip between them. Behind the wall of bronze, spears moved in deadly rhythm, thrusting and withdrawing with mechanical precision. Each motion was practiced, each strike purposeful. There was no wasted energy, no reckless advance, only control. The Spartans did not chase their enemies. They drew them in, absorbed the impact, and then struck back with devastating efficiency. As the Persians pressed forward, their numbers once again worked against them. Those in the front ranks were crushed into the Spartan line, unable to retreat, unable to maneuver. Their shields clashed against the solid wall before them, but it would not give. The Spartans pushed back in unison, a single step that carried the weight of 300 men acting as one. It was enough. The enemy line buckled, then broke. Leonidas moved along the formation, his presence a steady force amid the chaos. He watched for weakness, for any sign that the line might falter, but there was none. His warriors fought with the calm certainty of men who had accepted their fate. They did not fear death, they denied it, moment by moment, with every strike and every breath. The ground beneath them became treacherous, slick with blood, and littered with fallen weapons. The air grew thick with heat and the metallic scent of war. Yet the Spartans did not slow. They advanced again, shields pushing, spears striking, their formation never breaking, never losing its shape. To the Persians, it must have seemed as though the wall itself was alive, breathing, moving, crushing everything before it. Time lost meaning within the clash. The sun burned overhead, indifferent to the struggle below, as wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashed against the Spartan line and was thrown back. Some tried to climb over the fallen, others attempted to force their way through sheer numbers, but none could break the formation. And so the truth of Thermopylae revealed itself. Here, in this narrow passage, the might of an empire was being held at bay by 300 warriors who refused to yield. Chapter 7: Blood and Dust. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the battlefield of Thermopylae had been transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been solid ground was now churned into a mixture of dust, blood, and broken bodies. The air hung heavy with heat and the metallic scent of death, each breath thick and difficult to draw. The clash of steel had not ceased, but it had changed. What began as disciplined combat had descended into something more primal, more desperate. The Spartans still held their line, but the cost was no longer invisible. Their bronze shields, once gleaming, were now scarred and stained, their edges chipped from repeated impact. Their spears, though still deadly, showed signs of strain, wood splintering, points dulled from relentless use. Beneath their helmets, sweat mixed with dust and blood, running into their eyes, stinging, blurring vision, but still they fought. The Persians, too, had changed. The confidence of overwhelming numbers had been replaced by frustration and fury. They came harder now, pushing forward not just with orders, but with desperation. The narrow pass echoed with their cries, louder, more chaotic, as if sheer noise could break the Spartan resolve. They stepped over their fallen, driven onward by those behind them, trapped in a cycle of advance and death. Within the Spartan line, the strain began to show, not in their formation, which remained intact, but in the subtle shifts of movement. Arms grew heavier, breaths came shorter. A soldier stumbled for the briefest moment before regaining his footing, his shield lifting just in time to block an incoming strike. Another drove his spear forward with a sharp exhale, pulling it back more slowly than before. Fatigue crept in, silent but relentless. Leonidas saw it all. He moved through the ranks, his voice low but steady, offering not commands but presence. A hand on a shoulder, a glance held for a heartbeat, small gestures that carried immense weight. The men drew strength from him, just as they drew it from each other. This was no longer just a battle of bodies, but of will. The dust rose with every movement, swirling into the air until the battlefield became a haze of shifting shadows and flashing steel. Visibility blurred, sounds distorted, and yet the Spartans continued to fight with precision born from instinct and training. They no longer needed to see clearly. They knew their place in the line, knew the rhythm of the man beside them. As the light began to fade, the fighting slowed, not from decision, but from exhaustion. Both sides pulled back slightly, the intensity ebbing just enough to reveal the scale of what had been endured. Thermopylae had become a place of blood and dust, and the end was nowhere in sight.
Chapter 8. Silent Night. Night fell over Thermopylae like a heavy curtain, dimming the scars of battle beneath a cold, indifferent sky. The heat of the day faded, replaced by a creeping chill that settled into armor and bone alike. For the first time since the fighting began, the clash of steel gave way to silence, uneasy, fragile, and incomplete. It was not peace, but a pause, a brief suspension between violence and what was yet to come. The Spartans remained within the pass, their formation loosened but not broken. Small groups gathered where they stood, some tending to wounds, others sitting in stillness, conserving what strength remained. There were no loud conversations, no expressions of relief, only quiet endurance. A soldier carefully removed his helmet, revealing a face streaked with dirt and dried blood. Another adjusted the bindings on his arm, jaw clenched but silent. Pain was acknowledged, but never voiced. Fires burned low along the rocky edges of the pass, their flickering light casting long shadows that danced across shields and spears. The glow revealed the toll of the day, dented armor, cracked wood, and weary eyes that refused to close for long. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. Every man understood that the night offered no true rest, only preparation. Leonidas stood apart for a moment, gazing out into the darkness where the Persian army waited. Their presence was still there, vast and patient, marked by distant torchlight stretching across the horizon like a fallen constellation. Somewhere beyond the visible, plans were being made, strategies reconsidered, anger sharpened. The enemy had not been defeated, they had only been delayed. He turned back to his men, watching them in silence. These were not just warriors, they were the living embodiment of Sparta's will. Each one carried the weight of home, of family, of a legacy that demanded everything and promised nothing, and yet none had faltered. A young Spartan approached the edge of the pass, looking out into the night. For a brief moment he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel the stillness. Then he returned to his place without a word. There was comfort in routine, in discipline, in the unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came next together. Above them, the stars shone with distant clarity, untouched by the struggle below. Time moved quietly, measured not in hours, but in heartbeats and the slow return of strength. The night passed without attack, but no one believed it would last.
Chapter 9. The Second Assault. Dawn returned without mercy. The first light of day crept over the cliffs of Thermopylae, revealing once again the scarred battlefield and the men who still stood upon it. There was no dramatic signal, no moment of warning. The attack came swiftly, as if the night itself had only been a breath before violence resumed. The Persians advanced with renewed purpose. This was no longer a test of strength. It was a determined effort to break the Spartan line at any cost. Their formations were tighter, their movements more coordinated, and their numbers seemed even greater in the pale morning light. Drums thundered in a relentless rhythm, driving them forward, while officers shouted commands that echoed sharply against the stone walls of the pass. The Spartans were already in position. Shields rose, locking together with practiced precision. Spears lowered, forming the same deadly wall that had held the day before. But this time, the impact came faster, harder. The Persians did not hesitate as they entered the pass. They surged forward with force, colliding with the Spartan line in a violent crash that reverberated through the narrow corridor. The pressure was immediate. Wave after wave pressed against the phalanx, bodies forced forward by sheer momentum. The Spartans held, but the strain was unmistakable now. Their feet dug into the blood-soaked ground, muscles tightening as they resisted the crushing force. Shields groaned under the impact, wood and bronze bending but not breaking. "Hold!" the command rang out, steady and unwavering. The line responded. Spears struck out in unison, finding gaps in armor, driving back the front ranks once more. But the Persians adapted. Archers positioned themselves behind the advancing infantry, loosing arrows into the Spartan formation whenever an opening appeared. Some found their mark. A Spartan staggered, then fell, his place instantly filled by the man beside him. The line did not falter. The battle intensified, becoming more chaotic, more relentless. The Persians rotated their forces, sending fresh soldiers into the fight, while the Spartans remained, enduring without relief. Fatigue weighed heavier now, each movement demanding more effort than the last. Yet still they fought with discipline, refusing to yield even a single step. Leonidas moved along the line, his voice cutting through the noise, reminding them not of survival, but of purpose. This was their ground. This was their stand. Hours passed in a blur of motion and sound, the distinction between moments fading into a continuous struggle. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light over a battlefield that refused to quiet.
and though the Persians struck with greater force than before, the outcome remained unchanged. The Spartan line endured.
Chapter 10. Betrayal. While steel clashed and blood was spilled within the narrow pass, the fate of the battle was being decided far from the front lines, hidden among the jagged ridges that overlooked Thermopylae. There, beneath the cover of shadows and silence, a single act of betrayal began to unravel everything the Spartans had fought to hold. He was a local man, one who knew the land not as a battlefield but as home. The winding paths through the mountains, the narrow trails unseen by most, these were not secrets to him. But loyalty, unlike knowledge, is not always rooted in honor. Whether driven by fear, greed, or the promise of favor, he made his choice, and in doing so, he shifted the course of history. Under the guidance of this traitor, a chosen force of Persian soldiers began their silent march through the hidden mountain path. It was narrow, treacherous, and steep, but it offered something no army had yet possessed, a way around the Spartan defense. Step by careful step they advanced, their armor muted, their voices hushed, moving like shadows through the darkness of stone and brush. Back within the pass, the Spartans continued to fight, unaware of what was unfolding behind them. The clash remained fierce, the rhythm of battle unbroken. Shields locked, spears thrust, and the line held as it had since the beginning. But for the first time, the strength of their position, the narrowness of the pass, was no longer absolute. Leonidas sensed something, though he could not yet see it. A shift in the air, a subtle change in the flow of the battle. Experience had taught him that war was never static, that advantage could turn in an instant. He scanned the ridgelines briefly, his expression tightening, but the fighting demanded his focus. Hours passed. Then a runner arrived. Breathless and bloodied, the messenger pushed through the Spartan ranks until he reached the king. His words came in fragments, urgent and heavy with consequence. The enemy, the mountain path, they are behind us. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow further. Not the pass, but time itself. Leonidas did not react with shock. There was no visible anger, no outburst, only understanding. The battle had changed. What had once been a controlled stand was now a trap closing in from both sides. He turned once more toward his men, toward the line that had held against impossible odds. They had fought with unmatched discipline, with courage that would echo beyond their lives, and now they faced something even greater than numbers: inevitability. The gate of death had become exactly what its name promised. Chapter 11. The Final Choice. The truth spread quickly through the Spartan ranks, carried in hushed voices and solemn glances. The enemy was no longer just in front of them, it was behind them as well. The narrow pass that had once been their greatest advantage had become a cage. There would be no retreat, no reinforcement, no escape. Only a choice remained. Leonidas stood at the center of his warriors, his presence steady as ever, though the weight of the moment was undeniable. He looked upon the men who had fought beside him, who had stood unbroken against an empire, and knew what must be done. Not all of them needed to die here. He gave the order. Allied forces were to withdraw. The command was met with hesitation, confusion even. Some protested, unwilling to abandon the fight, unwilling to leave the Spartans behind. But Leonidas did not argue. His voice remained calm, firm, absolute. This was not surrender, it was preservation. The story of this stand had to live on, carried by those who would survive to tell it. Reluctantly, the non-Spartan soldiers began to fall back, casting final glances toward the line that had held firm beside them. Gratitude, sorrow, and disbelief filled their eyes, but they obeyed. They knew what this meant.
the Spartans remained. 300 warriors stepped forward once more, their formation tightening, their resolve hardening into something unshakable. No longer fighting for victory, they now fought for something greater: honor, legacy, and the unbreakable identity of Sparta itself. Leonidas moved before them, meeting their eyes one by one. There were no speeches, no need for grand words. Everything had already been said in their actions, in their oath, in the ground they had refused to yield. These men did not fear death. They had chosen it. A quiet understanding passed between them. This was the end. Yet there was no despair, only clarity. The sound of distant movement echoed once more from both ends of the pass now. The Persians were closing in, tightening the noose, preparing to crush what remained of the resistance. Leonidas turned toward the battlefield, lifting his spear one final time. "Spartans!" he called. The line answered as one, shields rising, feet planting firmly into the blood-stained earth. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady, "we dine in eternity." And with that, they prepared to meet their fate, not as victims, but as legends.
Chapter 12. The Last Stand. The final battle began without ceremony. There were no signals of honor, no pause for reflection, only the sudden eruption of violence as the Persians closed in from both sides of the pass. The trap had been set, and now it snapped shut with brutal certainty. Yet the Spartans did not retreat. They stepped forward. The clash was immediate and overwhelming. From the front, the Persian forces surged once more, their numbers pressing relentlessly into the narrow corridor. From behind, the flanking force emerged, descending from the mountain path with equal determination. For the first time, the Spartans were surrounded. Still, they fought. The phalanx adapted, shifting formation to meet threats from multiple directions. Shields turned, lines bent but did not break, and the once perfect wall became something more fluid, less structured, but no less deadly. Spears thrust until they splintered, their wooden shafts cracking under the strain of repeated impact. When they broke, the Spartans drew their swords without hesitation, stepping into closer combat where skill and resolve mattered more than reach. The fighting became intimate, brutal beyond measure. Steel met flesh at arm's length. Every strike carried the weight of survival, every movement driven by instinct and training honed over a lifetime. There was no room for fear, no space for doubt, only action. Leonidas stood at the heart of the chaos, his presence a constant amid the storm. His blade rose and fell with controlled precision, each motion purposeful, each strike lethal. Around him, his warriors fought with the same relentless focus, their exhaustion pushed aside by sheer will. The Persians pressed harder, their advantage finally realized. Fresh soldiers replaced the fallen, their numbers seemingly endless. The Spartans, however, had no such relief. Their ranks grew thinner with each passing moment, their bodies bearing the marks of countless strikes, their breathing heavy, their movements slower, but never weak. The ground beneath them was no longer solid. It shifted underfoot, layered with the fallen, slick and unstable. Yet they held their ground, refusing to be pushed back, refusing to surrender even a single step. Time dissolved into a blur of motion and sound. The world shrank to the space between one heartbeat and the next, between one strike and another. The sun rose higher, bearing witness to a battle that had transcended strategy and entered something far greater. This was no longer a fight for survival. This was defiance made flesh.
And even as the circle tightened, even as the weight of an empire bore down upon them, the Spartans did not yield.
Chapter 13. The Fall of the King. Amid the chaos of steel and blood, Leonidas remained at the center of the storm, a constant in a battle that had long since abandoned order. Around him, his warriors fought with unrelenting fury, their movements slower now, their strength tested beyond mortal limits. Yet their resolve had only hardened. They knew what this moment meant. They knew what would be remembered. The Persians pressed inward, their circle tightening with every passing breath. What had once been a battlefield had become a shrinking space of defiance, where every Spartan stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to yield even as the world closed in around them. The noise was overwhelming, shouts, clashes, the dull thud of impact, but within it all, Leonidas moved with clarity and purpose. A strike came from the left. He turned, deflecting it with his shield, answering with a swift counter that dropped his opponent instantly. Another followed from the right. He stepped forward, closing the distance, his blade finding its mark. There was no hesitation in him, no wasted motion. Even now, even at the edge of death, he fought as a king. But even kings are not beyond fate. The pressure mounted. More soldiers surged forward, their attacks less coordinated but more desperate, driven by sheer numbers. A spear slipped through the chaos, striking Leonidas beneath the edge of his shield. The impact staggered him just for a moment, but in battle, a moment is enough. He did not fall immediately. Instead, he steadied himself, planting his feet against the blood-soaked ground, raising his weapon once more. Those closest to him saw it, the wound, the strain, but they also saw something else, defiance. Even now, he would not yield. With a final surge of strength, Leonidas struck again, his blade cutting through the press of enemies before him. Then, as the weight of the wound overcame him, his body faltered. He dropped to one knee, then to the ground, the sounds of battle continuing around him without pause. A cry rose from the Spartans, not of fear, but of fury. They closed ranks instantly, forming a protective circle around their fallen king. The fighting intensified, each warrior striking with renewed force, as if Leonidas himself still stood among them. His fall did not break them, it ignited them. The Persians pressed harder, sensing the shift, determined to claim the body of the king as a symbol of their victory. But the Spartans would not allow it. Over their fallen leader, they fought with everything they had left, their formation tightening, their resolve absolute. Leonidas lay still, but his presence did not fade. In that moment, he became more than a man. He became a symbol.
Chapter 14. A Legend is Born. The fall of Leonidas did not mark the end. It transformed the battle into something greater. What remained of the Spartan force was no longer fighting for strategy or survival. They fought for memory, for meaning, for the unbreakable spirit that defined them. Around the body of their king they formed a final line, tighter and more resolute than ever before. The Persians advanced with overwhelming force, determined to crush the last resistance. Arrows rained down once more, darkening the sky, followed by waves of soldiers pressing forward from every direction. But the Spartans did not scatter. They stood as one, their shields raised, their blades ready, their silence more powerful than any war cry. One by one, they fell. A warrior took a blow to the shoulder but fought on, his sword rising and falling until his strength gave out. Another lost his shield, yet stepped forward regardless, striking with fierce precision before being overtaken. Each man fought not as an individual, but as part of something eternal, a legacy that could not be erased by death. The ground became sacred beneath them, every step marked by sacrifice, every fallen body a testament to courage. The Persians, though victorious in number, could not break the spirit before them. Even as the Spartan line thinned, its intensity only grew, each remaining warrior carrying the weight of all who had fallen before him. The battle raged in a final desperate fury. Steel clashed against steel, voices rose and fell, and the narrow pass echoed with the last stand of men who refused to yield. There was no retreat, no surrender, only resistance, pure and absolute. As the final Spartans were surrounded, their movements slowed but never stopped. Exhaustion claimed their bodies, but not their will. One last warrior stood over the fallen, his breathing heavy, his grip unsteady, yet his gaze unbroken. He raised his weapon one final time, meeting the tide of enemies before him. And then he too fell. Silence followed, not immediate, but gradual, as the sounds of battle faded and the weight of what had occurred settled over the field. The Persians stood victorious, but the cost of that victory lingered in the air, undeniable and heavy. For in that narrow pass, something had been forged that no army could destroy. A legend.
Chapter 15. Immortality. In the days that followed, the winds of Thermopylae carried more than dust and the fading echoes of battle. They carried a story. What had taken place within that narrow pass could not be buried beneath the fallen, nor silenced by the march of the victorious. It spread, carried by those who had witnessed it, by those who had escaped, and even by those who had stood on the opposing side and could not forget what they had seen. The field itself remained unchanged in its silence, marked by the remnants of a struggle that had defied reason. Broken spears lay scattered among shattered shields, and the ground bore the weight of sacrifice. Yet what lingered most was not the evidence of death, but the presence of something greater, something that could not be touched or taken. The Spartans had fallen, every one of them, just as they had known they would. But in their fall they had achieved something few ever could. They had stood against overwhelming odds and refused to yield. They had faced not only an army, but inevitability itself, and they had not broken. In Sparta, their names would be remembered, not as men who died, but as men who fulfilled their purpose without hesitation. Mothers would speak of them to their children, not with sorrow, but with pride. Their story would not be one of loss, but of strength, of discipline, of honor carried to its final breath. Beyond Sparta, their legacy would grow even further. Travelers would speak of the stand at Thermopylae in distant lands, recounting the tale of 300 warriors who held back an empire. The details would shift with time, as all stories do, but the truth at its core would remain untouched. Courage in the face of the impossible. Even the Persians, in their victory, could not erase what had been created there, for they had seen it firsthand, the unbreakable will of men who chose death over surrender. It was a victory that carried respect as much as triumph. Time would move on, as it always does. Empires would rise and fall, names would fade, and the world would change in ways none present at Thermopylae could have imagined. But some things endure beyond time. The memory of those who stand when all others would fall. The power of a single moment that defines eternity. And the truth that courage, once proven, never truly dies. Thermopylae was not remembered for its defeat. It was remembered for its immortality.